Hello and welcome back to the Copper Club podcast, where I'm delighted to be joined by CONCACAF expert Jon Arnold. Jon, how are we doing after an incredibly hectic group stage period?
Yeah, good. It's been busy. Some joys for CONCACAF, some sorrows for CONCACAF, and I'm looking at the entire tournament as well. So same, I think for obviously individual teams, some are feeling good, they might lift the trophy. Some are feeling bad, they're flying home. But I think there's some other things that have been good and bad about the tournament as well. I think kind of more than Euros or I don't know about the Oceania Nations Cup that's going on, but I think more than the Euros, there have been sort of these bright, brilliant moments and also these moments of frustration. And so it's just been a kind of interesting tournament mentally, emotionally for those of us who care about soccer in the Americas. It's been weird a little bit, but sometimes really fun and sometimes really frustrating, and it's been a balancing act, I think, for me at least personally.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, before we dive into the episode, I'm just going to hand the microphone over to you to introduce yourself and your work for people who may not know exactly who you are.
Yeah, so I've covered the CONCACAF region with a specialty in Mexico for the last decade. Used to work at goal.com as a staff writer there, did all the big tournaments covering Mexico for the US audience in English and the international audience in English. And I've started my own project called Getting CONCACAF. It's a newsletter. I always say if you get the joke in the newsletter name, then the newsletter itself is for you. Getting CONCACAF is a phrase we use for when the referee has been unfair to you and you feel like it was the fix is in or something a little less sinister, but something around that. So Getting CONCACAF is my unironic love letter to the region of CONCACAF. I tell stories from countries big, US, Mexico, Canada, and small, Anguilla, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, whatever comes across my radar. Trying to find that human side often features on players and countries that are trying to do things in an interesting way. So yeah, if you want to check out the newsletter, that's where I've been doing a daily edition during Copa America, just looking at all the different moments of action and everything. And then it's going to be kind of a funny transition because we'll go straight from that into I've got some stuff lined up on like Bon Air. So it'll be a little interesting going from Argentina or Uruguay or Brazil or whoever lifts the trophy and now back to kind of, but I do try and strike that balance. So if that sounds interesting to people, it's getconcacaf.substack.com, or you can just Google Getting CONCACAF.
Yep, we'll definitely put the links onto the podcast across Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. So click on that once, of course, you've listened to our episode this week. Now, I think the first thing to address, and we'll start on a negative note, really, and talking about, well, you did an excellent piece with The Guardian before we move into the US, which is probably even more negative. But there's been a lot of elements in and around the start of this tournament with low crowds, high temperatures, high prices, and you did a wonderful piece for The Guardian. So again, if you haven't checked that out, I'll do another plug for you, and definitely read it and find out a little bit more about Copa America, especially if you've just been focused on the Euros. But whilst we have you, Jon, you shed a little bit more light on Copa America and why it sort of hasn't been as successful as potentially we'd hoped in the US.
Yeah, it's been interesting because I think that at the end of the tournament, organizers, TV rights holders, Alejandro, all these figures will come out and say, this was a huge success. We moved the Copa America to the United States. Our friends in CONCACAF took part. And look how many stadiums we filled and look how many people watched on TV. And that will be true. But I think it will also be true that this tournament has already fallen well short of where it could have reached. The ticket prices are too high. They're not flexible enough on the prices themselves. And some of the decisions about games that maybe could be entry points or kind of almost a gateway drug for American fans who are curious about soccer or the international game but haven't really dipped in yet are totally inaccessible. So, there have been a couple games, especially in the group stage. Canada played Peru at 5 p.m. local time in Kansas City, outdoors. The heat index, which is measuring the temperature plus humidity, was more than 100 degrees Fahrenheit. I think that's like 44, 45 for the European audience. And the referee fainted and had difficulties with the heat, and the fans weren't happy. And I mean, do you want to sit in that heat? Even though we love the game, you'd rather watch it in a different setting. Another one was inside, thankfully, but in Las Vegas, Ecuador against Jamaica in a massive NFL stadium. The Ecuadorians, to their credit, showed up. There was a good group of fans, but still more than half the stadium empty and available. If you're in Las Vegas, a city known for events, for impulsive decisions, why not offer those tickets at $20 a pop on, to a bunch of guys on a bachelor party stag do on the strip?
Yeah.
Maybe you get more fans in there. There's just been a lot of these decisions where you're left looking at the organizers saying, why wasn't this a little more thought out? Why wasn't there a little more progressiveness? And it feels like a tournament that's marketed toward either people who are already fans or people who are wealthy and maybe could travel from Argentina to watch Messi in these amazing stadiums, or can put on Instagram that they're at this fancy stadium after they went shopping. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Those people should be welcome in the stadium. But so too should the immigrant fan here, maybe in Dallas-Fort Worth, where I sit, who wants to go see Chile or Peru in the first game here in DFW. And when they looked up to see what tickets were, it's $120 per ticket. And yet the stadium still could have held 30,000 to 35,000 more people. Obviously, the economics of it, you have to find a balance. They want to make money from this tournament. That's a whole part of the reason that it's in the U.S. But even with the marketing, even with the commercial elements, to me, it really is interesting that brands and products are desperate to be attached with this tournament, with Copa America. But the tournament itself and the organizers don't seem to care about reaching new fans. And to me, that's the biggest shame, especially ahead of the World Cup in 2026. How many thousands of people could have become fans of not soccer? I think a lot of people are already fans, but, of the game in the Americas or of their local national team, or just become a neutral fan who has a soft spot for Venezuela or Peru or these teams that have been, fun to watch during the tournament. Ecuador is a good example too. And I just think it's going to go down as a success for the organizers, but I think for those of us who really care about the game, as a missed opportunity to grow our numbers of fans. And those are the people who are going to be buying tickets, not just in 2026 when it's the World Cup, but maybe would travel to the next edition of Copa America and maybe start a lifelong love affair with soccer in this region. And instead, I think, are more likely to spend their money on the European club friendlies that are going to come here in a month. I think one quick point before I'll stop kind of ranting, Nathan, is clearly the U.S. soccer market is something that everyone wants to get a piece of. And that's why the Copa America is here, because we have dollars and there's growing interest. But you have to understand, if you're an organizer of a tournament like this, and CONCACAF does this too, and U.S. soccer does this too, that you're not just competing against the Euros. You're competing against every single thing that's happening. So if I'm a U.S. sports fan, I can choose to go to a Copa America match or to a Major League Baseball game. But I can also choose to go to a Copa America match or the Wrexham friendly that's coming to my city in a few months or a few weeks. I can choose to go to Copa America or save my money for next summer's Club World Cup. I can choose to go to Copa America or say, you know what? I'm going to budget for the 2026 World Cup. There's just so many options, even if you're already capturing a soccer fan. And so if you're not really putting yourself in front of these people, I just think it's really difficult to create that connection that leads to future success. It's short-sighted to me.
Yeah, I completely agree. And like you said there, with Messi in Argentina and then Brazil, we've seen big crowds, and that's all well and good, but it almost feels like some of the CONCACAF nations, and as you touched on there, Peru, Chile, were a bit of an afterthought, and that just leaves a bit of a sour taste from the tournament. But with most
Nathan,
of them exiting now,
you'll know, I was going to say that, you look at past editions of Copa, and CONMEBOL is all too happy to punt on some of these quote unquote less sexy games. You look at the numbers from 2019 in Brazil. I was in Chile in 2015. And I think you'll feel the same, where it's a shame that, we can all agree that Bolivia is not a big ticket team. But if your Copa America matches in your city, if you're in Brazil and you're in Chile, you should be able to go. People want to go. And yet you look at the attendance numbers, people are trashing on the United States edition because there's certain games that are, even I'm doing a quarterfinal here in Dallas, Canada, Venezuela. The Venezuelans will show up, but it'll be less than we're at the group games. But you look at past editions, and it just seems like CONMEBOL, Nathan, is happy to say, it's okay if people don't care about these games because they really care about these games. But why not try and get people at all the games?
Exactly, because we could be witnessing Venezuela in the semi-finals, and no one, like you said, they have been attracting a big amount of fans. But we'll park that and we'll get to it, because I want to continue with the negativity so we can finish the show on a high. And so it only feels right to move across to, we're talking about Copa America in the US, so we will talk about the hosts, the US, obviously. the first nation or the first host of Copa America to be knocked out in the group stage. And within the group, Uruguay, Panama, and Bolivia. And we'll definitely throw some plaudits to the way of Panama in a minute. But I think it's really important to focus on the US because there was high expectations that they were going to rival Uruguay for first spot. And then here we are, they've failed to even get out of the group. And as you've just touched upon there, in terms of trying to attract fans to the game, this was a hugely missed opportunity for the US national team. What was your thoughts on covering them over the last couple of weeks? And obviously, huge disappointment, but more insight from you, please.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's a failure. It's a failure to not get out of the group, partly because they're the host nation, but I think more than anything because this is a team that everyone is expecting to do big things in 2026. To me, this had to be sort of the trampoline to 2026. This had to be the lead up, get some positive momentum going. You know, there's a lot of anger around the manager, Greg Berhalter, right now, which I think is totally fair. This is a talented team with players playing at the top level and players not just playing at the top level, but who can put that on the field. You know, I think we can see examples of, you know, a James who he shows up for his country, not always for his club, always vice versa. There's some players who show up for their club, not for their country. Santi Jimenez of Mexico is a player putting in that category right now. The U.S. has players who show up for both. Disappointing tournament for a few, but at the same time, you know, this is a team that has enough individual talent to believe that they could do something good in 2026. And that should get out of this group in 2024. I think Greg Berhalter, the manager, is going to sort of defend himself by saying this is a very fluky tournament. You know, there was a red card in the second game against Panama, but then the U.S. scored right after. So in a lot of ways, the U.S. was still felt like they were in control of that game, and then they lost it. They concede. They go to a very defensive posture. They concede again, and then they're kind of stuck in this defensive mode and can't do anything forward. And then against Uruguay, it was an okay performance considering how good Uruguay is. But at the same time, you put yourself in this situation with the Panama game to where you needed to score, you needed a goal, and they couldn't do it. I think too many times against top teams, the U.S. has found themselves in that situation where you can list attacking talent and say, man, Christian Pulisic, fantastic year with Milan, fantastic season, not even a bad Copa America, but he couldn't do it against Uruguay. Balogun, the forward, gets injured. Pepe comes in, Sargent comes in, they do okay, but not enough. Gio Reyna, okay, not enough. But I think all of it comes down to kind of the fact that the U.S. went into this tournament, I think, believing that they were going to get through no problem from the group, and it's not that kind of tournament. And even Panama being a CONCACAF team, you can't just take it for granted that you're going to win. You have to go out and do it. You can't collapse when something goes wrong. It's Copa America. You'll get a referee as bad as the one you had against Uruguay, and oh boy, he was bad. But you have to kind of overcome those things, right? You have to overcome a red card. You have to overcome a rough moment. They just didn't have sort of the mentality or the ability to do it. So I think ultimately it's a tournament that goes down as a massive, massive disappointment for the U.S. and one that puts them in a situation where ahead of 2026, where all this expectation is on the team. That's the real one where, as the host nation, everyone's not just saying get out of the group. Everyone's saying make a historic run, do something we haven't seen before in decades and decades and decades. But they don't look like they're a threat to do that right now.
Do you think Panama were potentially underestimated because they were only 1-0 down to Uruguay until the last few minutes when they started to pile it on a little bit more than expected, but they defended incredibly well there. Everyone expected Uruguay to turn up and it finished 4-5, 6-0. And 3-1 was potentially a little bit harsh in the end where they obviously got tired from Uruguay's constant pressure. Do you think Panama were sort of, it was a bit unfair to put them in the same bracket as Bolivia because this is a poor Bolivian side. And Panama obviously a lot closer to the US than most expected, which was quite refreshing to see. And yes, they've got Colombia next, which may see their journey come to an end. But what a fairy tale story for them to actually even get out of the group.
Yeah, and as a journalist, I always advocate for having as much information as possible, but I wonder if there was information overload because Panama was missing 5 players who we would say are their typical starters going into that match against the United States. Puma Rodriguez injured in the Uruguay game, 2 center backs unable to play in the tournament at all. They weren't able to replace Anibal Godoy, this sort of hard man midfielder who brings so much experience, one of the few players remaining from kind of Panama's past generation that was able to get to the 2018 World Cup, the first qualification to the World Cup for this historically baseball-loving country. Your listeners probably kind of can draw some parallels with Venezuela when you talk about the culture, the sporting culture of Panama, with the U.S. influence, mostly negative, but I guess we gave them baseball. Hooray. We all got Mariano Rivera out of it. But you know, you look at this country that hasn't traditionally been a power in soccer, and yet they get to the 2018 World Cup. Then they don't get to 2022, and they keep Thomas Christensen on board, which I think was kind of a brave move. It'd be easier to fire your manager after you miss a World Cup when you say our standard is now to make the biggest tournament, this showpiece tournament every year. They stick with Christensen. They didn't have a good Nations League. They get hit with injuries before the tournament. They have to open against Uruguay. But, you know, you listen to Bielsa after the game, and he's saying, like, I can't believe that 15-minute stretch where they were so much better than us. Like, what are we doing? And, you know, that's Bielsa. He's always going to find, you know, that needle in a haystack of bad to motivate, to use, to improve. But he was right. Panama had a stretch of the game where they were really, when they were down 1-0, where you thought, oh my goodness, they might come back after that first half from Uruguay that was just sort of out of this world. So I definitely think that it was an underestimation of Panama. And again, like, maybe, you know, I don't know what the conversations were with the U.S. Of course, they'd say, no, we always respect Panama. We weren't overconfident. But I think the combination of knowing Panama well, having beat them often in CONCACAF Nations League, World Cup qualification, all these different tournaments in the past, and seeing, oh, it's not even the main guys. You know, their best defenders aren't there. Their best winger isn't there. Their most veteran midfielder isn't there. And then in this Bolivia game and against Colombia, their best player won't be there because of Coco Carrasquilla cynically taking down Christian Pulisic, getting a red card and extra suspension. He's not there either. So you look at this Panama team, you say 6 players that they would want to have there are not there, and yet there they are in the quarterfinals, and the U.S. isn't. So I guess that's the thing, is that the excuses of the U.S. ring quite hollow when you look at what Panama was able to overcome. And that's before you get into sort of cultural things like, oh, baseball, population size, whatever you want to say. So yeah, absolutely, I think Panama was overlooked a bit because of what they still could bring in the starting lineup, and then that second game in the second half off the bench.
The other nation to squeeze through their group in Canada. Now, this is an interesting one because they scored 1 goal, relied on red cards in the game against Peru and Chile, where they played over 130 minutes against 10 men. And then we talk about the heat and the conditions which they played in. That was interesting because they have almost, and I don't want to say they fluked their way through, but they got very fortunate in terms of how their games came across. Maybe I'm being overgenerous by saying they didn't. I'm going to rephrase that. Canada did do a fluke. They were very fortunate to get through. They scored 1 goal, minus goal difference, scraping through. And I think they were fairly fortunate that it was only 2-0 against Argentina in the opening game, where they missed a hatful of opportunities.
Yeah.
And it's going to be a really interesting tie with them in Venezuela. And the head coaches came out just in March and said that they were almost surprised by the power and the pace of the South American teams. And look, Peru have been awful in the World Cup qualifiers, 1 goal, sitting bottom. Yet until that sending off, they gave Canada a runaround, to be honest with you. And Venezuela, I've been massively impressed with them. So we can sort of tie that in and talk about that particular quarterfinal. Venezuela won all 3 group stage games for the first time in their history. Their comeback, even more impressive stat, was their comeback against Ecuador was the first time in 166 matches that they came from behind to win outside of Venezuela. Fernando Batista is building something beautiful there. And looking at the bookmakers and what people are thinking as the favourites, Canada are sort of being sided to get out of that. But from what I've seen, I'll be very surprised if Canada get through here from what I've seen from both sides. And it's almost, when it comes to Canada, I'm not really sure how they've sort of, the US would probably be very jealous as to where Canada are. And considering the performances have probably been a lower level from the US. And here we are, we've just been slating the US for the last 5 minutes. Yet it's Canada in the final 8.
And Mexico too. You know, Mexico in that group with Venezuela, their performances, they won the first game against Jamaica, and their performances in the other 2 games, I think they were better than Venezuela, and I think they were better than Ecuador, but they couldn't finish. And that's kind of important in soccer. If you don't score, you can't win. And that's what happened with Mexico, right? You know, you had this lack of finishing, and I think that, you know, Canada definitely rode their luck. one caveat I would put on it is that Jesse Marsch is just getting into the job, and he had this sort of baptism by fire. Canada, sort of funny, like leading into the 2022 World Cup, they couldn't book friendlies. They screwed up some of the things leading into the tournament as far as getting a good matchup. And it sort of seemed like they were saying, oh, you want tough friendlies? Fine, here we go. We fixed it. And before this tournament played the Netherlands and France, and then played Argentina for the opening game. So I think that in a lot of ways, those games count and those games matter. But Jesse Marsch's first quote unquote, not real game, but like the first game where you'd say, oh, we can judge him on the performance was that Peru match, which you mentioned was conditioned by the red card. I think was really conditioned as well by the heat, the physicality. And also, like, Fossati has them playing in a way where, yeah, they're the worst team in World Cup qualification, but I think they'll be, judging on the results in Copa America, Paraguay might take that title once things get back going again this fall. We can talk more about that in a couple of months, Nathan. But I think that Canada is a better team than they showed in those games, but also credit to them for grinding out the result. Mexico couldn't do it. The U.S. couldn't do it. Some of the South American teams weren't able to do it, and Canada kind of plays the game, gets through, and now I think is in a really interesting situation against a tough Venezuela team. I wonder if the time now between the group stage matches and being Group A, I don't think hurts, and the knockout game helps Canada understand a little bit more of, okay, this is actually what this manager wants. Or if the manager says, you know what, I'm going to reduce it to the studs. These guys are going to have to figure out this game plan this day. And that time might help a little bit for a team that's under a totally new manager who had, I think, 2 weeks to go into those friendlies, the Argentina game, and now has had 4 or 5 days to prepare. The one caveat to that is Tejan Buchanan, one of their finest attackers, took a serious injury in training yesterday, as we're talking, Tuesday during the week. He's not going to be available. It sounds like he's going to be a long-term absence. So not having Tejan Buchanan is going to force Jesse Marsch to get creative. But I will say I haven't been impressed with how they've attacked in the first 3 games, and even in the friendly against France. Now, again, probably grading on a curve there. You don't expect them to be bombing forward and scoring 5 goals against France. But at the same time, I wonder if putting an attacking variation in is going to force Jesse Marsch into finding something that might work a little better. Not that Tejan Buchanan shouldn't be a starter in this team in the future, but simply sometimes those changes, especially during the course of a tournament, can help boost. I think you're right. For me, Venezuela is the most likely team to go through for a number of different reasons. But I do think that Canada, while they might not, quote unquote, deserve the place for the performances, they deserve it for the points they got. They've earned this place, and now it's time for them to show exactly what they can do, I think.
Let's just touch on Venezuela, because I feel like they deserve at least a couple of minutes, because I've been very impressed with them, to be honest with you. And what I've really liked about Batista is he's not been afraid to change formation or players when it's been against him during the group stage, which is quite rare to see in modern day football. Managers can be quite stubborn. We've seen it throughout the Euros in terms of leaving late changes or sticking with the exact formation. He's often changed his wingers. He's, especially against Ecuador in that first game, he changed it into a high press, used the heat and that man advantage for them to end up getting the 2 goals. Solomon Rondon, who people who haven't been keeping a close eye on him since his departure from Europe, probably came into the tournament as the most informed striker, scored the last couple of goals. In behind as well, I think they just have a few unknown players. Yes, they have Savarino, they have Soteldo, they have Herrera from Girona, so they have experience in there which people may not realise. But players like Edouard Bello, who scored that incredible acrobatic equaliser against Brazil in the South American qualifiers, he scored 2 as well. So there's so many attacking options there for Venezuela, and it's that high press approach which is earning them the points.
Yeah, we talked about, players that you are sort of sometimes surprised to see play well with their country and not with their club, or vice versa. Bello plays in Mexico at Mazatlan, a club that isn't well respected, let's say, that doesn't necessarily, you'd rarely say, oh, they play beautiful football about them, and yet when he comes into this Venezuela team and in this tournament so far, it just seems like he's so hungry to contribute and can excel in that sort of system that he's being asked to play. I think that, it was very easy for me when I was looking at this Venezuela squad before the tournament to look at Rondon and say, well, he's the most informed player. He's kind of a more traditional 9 than I think a lot of the forwards in this tournament and in modern football in general. But who do they have to sort of lump it into Rondon? And that hasn't been the tact. And I think Venezuela is definitely bettered from it. And Rondon himself has shown that he can do a little bit more than maybe I was giving him credit for, even after watching the tremendous campaign he had with Pachuca, where they don't win the CONCACAF Champions Cup without many contributions from him. But there they are lifting the trophy because of how good he's been. So I think those, the way that attack has been integrating, and I think that the fresh faces that you mentioned has really helped Venezuela. And I would kind of expect them to continue to do that against a Canada team that is aggressive. Their physicality has been a bit overrated, I think. Some managers have said some weird stuff about Canada that I don't quite think is true. Yeah, they're kind of quote unquote physical, but they're not. They don't come out with a knife between their teeth. But anyway, against a team that managers perceive as physical, I wonder if we won't see more variation. And I think you could see this Venezuela team. Yeah, I mean, look, at this point, anyone can make a run, and there's no reason that Venezuela can't be in that category.
On that side of the draw, it's obviously the holders, the favourites, Argentina versus Ecuador. And we've not learnt too much about Argentina. We know they're going to go out and win football matches, and they've had a very easy route so far. I think the only sort of negative you could say is that they've drawn all games at halftime 0-0. But when teams put two banks of five behind the ball, it can be really difficult to break down. But obviously, in the end, Argentina win football matches, and they've only lost 2 games in 60 plus now. Obviously, that iconic Saudi Arabia game in Qatar, but Uruguay, which could be really important if those two meet in the final, which would be really interesting. Ecuador edged through against, well, it was between them and Mexico in the end. But how do you see this game? Is it a formality for Argentina once again, or can Ecuador cause them a few problems? Because in the South America World Cup qualifiers, they needed a moment of magic, from Messi from a free kick in order to get over the line in Buenos Aires. So again, Ecuador will probably be looking at the other teams and seeing how long they can hold Argentina for. But that's easier said than done.
No, absolutely. I don't think it's a formality, but before the tournament, I was talking to some friends in Ecuador, and they were expressing a lot of frustration about Felix Sanchez, the manager. I kind of didn't see it, right? I was like, you know what? I don't know, man. The results are there. When I've watched them in qualification, they look good. Obviously, we all know about oh my gosh, the young generation, the number of players that come through from Independiente del Valle is unbelievable. And those players are supplemented with other players who come from, it just, and I'm actually, look, a bit of an inner Valencia romantic. I've always loved him since he's played in the CONCACAF region, and I just think he's a great player. But that being said, I think they've been disappointing in this tournament, and I definitely understand now the Ecuador fan criticism of Sanchez, because you have this generation, you have these players who can flash, who can do things that are totally different, and yet it just doesn't seem like they're kind of allowed to, or being asked to, or being given the freedom to. And that game against Mexico, again, I think Mexico is a better team that couldn't finish. And you're like, how is an Ecuador side with all these different, creative players, attacking players only coming through? And I don't think that they put a single shot on target, or maybe I'm recalling wrong. No, they did one or two, but no, I mean, it just wasn't good enough. Right. And so I think that I wouldn't call it a formality. Messi's health is something that obviously is interesting. It's Messi. We've seen him kind of say, oh, I'm a little hurt, and then he's still the best player in the world, and it doesn't matter. So I definitely think Argentina will go through. I totally agree with you. We haven't learned anything. We haven't seen them tested, and I'm not sure this is where the test comes. I just haven't seen enough from Ecuador on either side, really. I think to sort of say, oh man, this is going to be so difficult for Argentina to find that goal to break them down. To me, if Ecuador gets through, it'll be obviously a massive shock.
Yeah, definitely. And I completely agree with you as well. I spoke to some Ecuadorian experts and journalists around it, and they were very anti Felix Sanchez. And I was of view, well, the results have been pretty good during South American World Cup qualifiers. But in particular, that Mexico game, it was a lot of long ball bypassing Moses Caicedo, Kendry Paez, Alan Minder, people who can get on the ball and make things happen. But if the ball's in the air, that's going to play to, Argentina's defence is probably the best in the competition, maybe even the world at the moment, with their centre-back pairing in Christian Romero and Sandro Martinez. So if they go with that strategy, it's not going to work for them. The only time we've seen them come alive was against Jamaica because they left big gaping holes at the back, which they could then
Yeah.
run into and explore. And I don't think Argentina are going to be doing that.
No, I don't think they'll be as tired either. I think that Jamaica squad was already a little short-handed, and we're starting to try and push forward and get something. I mean, that minute to go was so fun, and it's a great highlight, but it doesn't happen. That's not going to happen against Argentina. But also because it doesn't seem like they're being able to sort of play that
Mm.
style to find that distribution from the center and then get off and running. It just hasn't really, those moments. Maybe the other teams in the group should get a little more credit for keeping that from happening, but it doesn't seem like that's what they're playing for either. And if you're not in those, if you're not winning those transition moments, if you're not giving the defenses something to think about when those young players have the ball at their feet, then I don't think you're going to find too much success.
Absolutely. And we've spoken about Panama and giving them some praise, but let's give more praise to their opponents, Colombia, who are
Yeah.
26 games unbeaten, 2.5 years. And I think it's important to point out because sometimes international teams go on these huge unbeaten runs. And then people go, yeah, but they've played X, Y, and Z who haven't been good enough. Well, they beat Spain earlier this year, who put out a very good side, who were looking very dangerous at the Euros. And in 2023, they beat not only Brazil, but they beat Germany as well. So it's been massively impressive. And you know what? By finishing top of that group with Brazil in it, they have been rewarded with Panama. But what I do like about this side is we don't know if it's 2024 or 2014 because James Rodriguez has rolled back the years, 3 assists, player of the match, at least in the first game, if my memory serves me well. And he's been so exciting to watch in the middle, considering he's played 150 minutes or less for Sao Paulo, barely getting a kick, and they've been trying to get rid of him for a while. And as you've touched upon earlier in the podcast, he's that player who just turns up for his country. And the fact that set pieces are now Colombia's not so secret weapon, as well as all these attacking players in terms of Luis Diaz, John Arias, Rafael Borre, who's probably been the weak link at the moment out of those in the forward line. But then they have Lerma and Richard Rios. There's so many players to like about here. And their draw against Brazil, on paper, people will wake up and see that. But Colombia should have probably won that game and they bossed that midfield. So I don't think you can rule out Colombia yet. So people can hear me in my voice and what I'm talking about, that they probably will get through Panama. But Colombia, they're no longer dark horses in this competition and they have a real opportunity to go all the way, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Before the tournament, I said my 3 favorites were Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, and maybe a bit disrespectful to Colombia with the streak that they came in on, with the sort of interesting mashup that you have of, like a Luis Diaz who's doing it at the absolute top level, James Rodriguez who's not doing it at all, except for at the international level. And some of these kind of rising stars, Arias, you mentioned, I think is like so fun to watch. He's been really, really good in a Colombia shirt and in like Libertadores and stuff too, but, you don't necessarily see him as much just if you're kind of popping in and popping out. Another throwback the years guy for me is Davinson Sanchez. Maybe I needed to be paying more attention, but like I thought, loved watching him as a rising player. And we had Juan Carlos Osorio here in this region for a long time. So, kind of discovered by Osorio. So I always kept an eye on him. Oh, that's so interesting. And then totally fallen off my radar. And then I was like, man, this guy's still doing it in qualification. As I'm watching those matches and coming into this tournament, I'm like, well, it seems like he's kind of the James Rodriguez situation too, where you're just like, man, like, okay, the weak link, I guess, is the defense, because you mentioned the midfield, you mentioned what James is doing, the Lucho scoring, but the defense looks fine. Like, it doesn't, I wouldn't say it's, the best in the tournament, but it's good too. And I think another kind of turn back the years candidate. So you just have this interesting mix of it all coming together. A manager that like was, from my understanding, kind of like an assistant his entire life and just suddenly is overseeing a team that can't lose. It's a lot of fun to watch. I think they're a fun team. I think they do a good job randomly, but I'll mention it like on social media. Their graphics are fun. Their tone is fun. That's what football is about, especially at the international level, man. So many of these international teams are so serious and so stern and don't want to show people that side of the players. And what's the point? That's what international football is for. So to me, I picked them to be the number 1 team in the group. I thought they would get out, so maybe I wasn't that disrespectful to them. But now it's time to make it happen, and I think we're all kind of penciling or penning them in the next round with all love and respect to Panama.
Yeah, and if they do bump into Brazil again, they're going to be fairly confident because of their performance. They should have easily beaten them. I know there was that controversial penalty for Vinicius Junior in
Yeah.
true Copa America fashion. You've already touched upon the referees, so we'll move across to the next tie involving Brazil Uruguay. And people outside in, say people who've been focused on the Euros and not looking at this, will be going, "Well, Brazil, this will be a tough game. This will be an exciting one. Brazil should be favourites." But people who are closer to the action, Brazil were a car crash in 2023, and they slapped a band-aid on when they brought in Dorival Jr. and beat England at Wembley with a mismatched team and drew with Spain at the Bernabeu. But the friendlies coming into the tournament saw them leaky in defence. And in this group stage, I can't put my finger on it. This is probably why I don't earn the big bucks, because I can't figure out a solution for them. But Vinicius Jr. was awful against Costa Rica, then really good against Paraguay, and then almost non-existent last night. And it's the same sometimes with Rodrigo. Savio's come in and been great. The midfield three has of Guimaraes, Paqueta, and João Gomez. Like, apart from Paqueta, Brazil have normally had these world-class players who can deal with the pressure. And now, no disrespect to like João Gomez, but for him to be starting for Brazil, it's almost unheard of if you were to go back 5-6 years. And there's just that lack of consistency all the time. Where with Uruguay under Bielsa, it's very much like Argentina. We haven't learned anything new, but they've gone about their business, and they probably have the strongest team in the competition away from Argentina, which for me, Argentina Uruguay would be an amazing final, and it almost seems to be lined up for that. But what do you make of this game? And let's have a look, focus on Brazil first, because I can't figure it out. But John,
Yeah.
can you?
No, you say you don't earn the big bucks because you can't figure it out, but I don't think Dorival Jr. can figure it out. I
Yeah,
don't.
yeah,
I think it's like it's a bit of a mystery. And again, we're talking about, well, why is the guy who's great at club level and Vini, why is he struggling at the international level? That Paraguay game, I think, was such a chance for a breakout that then didn't really come in the Colombia match. That's okay, but I just think that obviously international is different, and getting a yellow card in that game is bad.
yeah. Well, yeah,
He's
suspended now for that
he's
Uruguay game, which
suspended.
is important. Yeah,
And so you're looking and you're saying, not only is he out, but do you say, if Brazil get through, is Brazil better without Vinicius? Like, I think those whispers, even though he's a player
yeah,
that could
yeah,
win
yeah.
Ballon d'Or, like he's a player, those whispers will start to become murmurs that become phrases spoken out loud if they get through. If they don't, then I think everyone's like, oh, kind of need your best player, which is no surprise. It just hasn't come together, and I think I don't think it. It sounds like I'm coming down on Dorival Jr. I'm not. I think that any of these kind of veteran Brazilian managers who you just stick in there probably would have had the exact same fate. This is a team that thought it was going to have Carlo Ancelotti running it, and these guys aren't
Yeah.
Ancelotti. These guys are not managers who understand the world class level. Now, look, he might have struggled too. He doesn't know the international game as well as some of Bielsa or some of his counterparts, right? So, but I just think that expectation not matching the reality
Mm.
mentally would be very difficult to overcome. Not when you're planning the match, not when you're drawing up the tactics for the game, not when you're looking specifically at Uruguay, but I think big picture overall, that expectation of Ancelotti and world class manager not having the reality of, hey, we've got Dorival Jr. and he's going to do his best, and we all know him from Brazil. I just think that's tough to overcome, especially when there are other challenges in the squad of like, hey, why is this not clicking? Why don't we look like we're that good in attack, even though we have all these world-class players? And yeah, I can't figure it out either. For me, Uruguay is the favorite in this game, and I don't know. I'm picking them to go through, and I don't really see that much of a counter argument other than, hey, it's Brazil.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And what was quite interesting slash worrying, what Dorival Jr. said was before that Costa Rica game, was because they were conceding goals pre-tournament. It was almost, he said that I wanted to focus on defensive issues in training, and then allow my attacking players just to express themselves. But there has to be some sort of plan. And I feel like even if they play Rafinha or Savio's had a good tournament, to be fair, Rodrigo and Vinicius Jr., there's no direct number 9 there. And the fact that Hendricks had such limited minutes, I sometimes feel the fact that you have three wingers operating in the same space and
Yes.
not having a natural goal scorer through the middle has hindered them. Whereas Uruguay have Darwin Núñez, and although he hasn't necessarily, he's like Marmite, he's an enigma with Liverpool, but under Bielsa, they have this bond and this relationship, and they just seem to blossom together. 5 goals during the South American World Cup qualifiers, a couple in Copa America. Everything seems to be clicking for Uruguay.
Yeah, and I think it's an understanding of the plan, right? An understanding of the tactics that almost every Bielsa team has. But Uruguay, watching them in person from a very high angle at Arrowhead Stadium, people were complaining about the television broadcasts, and the press box was basically on the same level. And but you could see, oh, this is where they overload, and this is where the fullback creeps up for the switch, and this is why it's so effective. No one, you're seeing it happen, but if you're the defender for the U.S., you can't get over there. You're occupied. You see that system work. You see the press. How I think it's people overrate, I think, just how kind of often it's happening, but when it happens, when the press trigger hits, it's really difficult to deal with. I actually thought the U.S. did pretty well, and maybe Brazil will do well too. But I think you just see a team that understands what it's being asked to do, that has the personnel to do it, and Brazil's not at that place right now because of this transition. And yeah, I think Endrick, man, like I understand not wanting to put a pressure on such a young kid, but if you had put pressure on him earlier, then now he would be adapted to it. Now it's, I think, too late. For me, you can't put him in and say, good luck, man, start the quarterfinal against Uruguay. That's too much pressure. But if you would come in saying, all right, man, it's a World Cup I don't know. I don't think Brazilians say man, but okay, it's a World Cup qualification match against the top team. You're getting the start today. We expect you to do your best just like we know you can. And that kind of becomes a pattern and becomes normal. Then it's not so serious when you need to start him against Uruguay. But now I totally agree with, hey, this might be too much pressure to be putting on a young player who already has plenty of it and is kind of asked, hey, don't call me Pelé. Don't say I'm the next XYZ. Let me develop, and totally fairly. But that pressure will come if that's the situation, right? So, yeah, I think they kind of missed their opportunity to get him used to being the international starter and everything that goes with being Brazil's number 9. And I think it might cost him in this tournament.
Well, especially against Paraguay. It was 4-1 in the end. What an opportunity that was to give him more than like 20 minutes, half an hour, perfect environment where if he makes a mistake or two, it doesn't matter because it's a carnival atmosphere. But look, Jon, we'll leave it there. But before I let you go, thank you very much for your time. It's been really insightful, especially from the CONCACAF point of view. But I can't let you go without giving me your Copa America 2024 winner.
I said before the tournament, I think Argentina beats Uruguay in the final. Now that we've got a sample size of 3 games for every team, I think Argentina beats Uruguay in the final. The only thing that's kind of getting me nervous about my picks is, first of all, some of my other picks have been really bad. I thought the U.S. and Mexico would get through, but that's my CONCACAF bias at heart, I think. Uruguay's road is so much more difficult. We're saying Brazil's not the great Brazil that we know and many people romanticize and love, but it's still Brazil. They still have so much talent. And then if you get past them, you're likely facing red hot Colombia that's been so good that we talk about as well. Uruguay's road is just so much more difficult, but I still am sticking with my kind of gut instinct of Argentina beating Uruguay in the final. What's yours, Nathan? I'll put you on the spot too.
No, I said all along, I think I wrote my first column about Copa America back in January, and I went with an Argentina-Uruguay final there. So I'm going to have to stick with it, but it wouldn't surprise me if Colombia sort of sneak through. They don't have as hard a game against Panama, as you said there. Like Uruguay could get to that final a little bit leggy, a little bit tired, having gone through it, where Argentina may be able to rotate a little bit. And I think that will go in their favour. So I know we're picking the favourites, but I would love it if Colombia got to the final. I think it would be so entertaining, and I think a European audience would love it a lot more because they've been the most refreshing side, bar Venezuela, to probably watch away from the teams people know about. So I'm on the same page as you, and I just see Messi bowing out with yet again another trophy. But Jon, look, I really appreciate your time. Once again, I'll put your plugs in the links to all platforms across Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. And yeah, thanks for your time once again.
My pleasure. Chat soon.